Today, we rely on gas stoves, electric ovens, even microwaves to keep our meals warm. But imagine a grand feast in a 14th century castle where dozens of dishes had to be served at the same time. How did they keep the food from going cold before it reached the table? Without electricity or modern appliances, medieval cooks had to get creative, using glowing embers, hot ashes, and even blankets of dough to keep every dish steaming. In the heart of every medieval kitchen stood the hearth, a massive stone fireplace that was far more than just a place for cooking. It was the center of life, warmth, and survival. For cooks, it was their most trusted tool in keeping food hot. Pots of stews and broths were suspended on iron hooks that could be raised or lowered, allowing chefs to control the heat with surprising precision. If the dish needed a gentle simmer, the pot could be lifted higher, away from the fiercest flames. For a quick boil, it was lowered directly above the glowing coals. The hearth wasn't only a single flame. It often spread wide across the kitchen wall, big enough to hold multiple pots at once. Cooks could shuffle cauldrons closer to the embers or pull them back as needed. In this way, meals were staged and kept warm until the moment of serving. Large slabs of meat, already roasted, might be set on a spit near the heat to keep their juices from cooling and congealing. Even bread could be warmed by laying it on flat stones close to the fire. The hearth, with its constant blaze, was the medieval version of today's stovetop and warming tray combined. It demanded skill and attention, for there was no dial to turn, no timer to set, only the cook's eye and instinct. The flickering light of the fire not only warmed the food, but filled the kitchen with a glow that symbolized abundance. Without this central blaze, no banquet could have stayed hot long enough to impress the noble guests who dined in the great hall. After the cooking was finished, the fire still had more to give. Medieval cooks understood that glowing embers and hot ash were nature's slow cookers and warmers. Instead of letting food cool quickly, they would harness the leftover heat. Heavy cast iron pots filled with stews or sauces could be buried partially in a bed of embers. A lid placed firmly on top was then covered with hot coals, surrounding the dish in a cocoon of warmth. This method kept the food at a steady temperature without scorching it. Imagine a pot of spiced wine slowly resting in the ashes, ready to be ladled out steaming hot hours after it had been prepared. Or a dish of tender meat kept moist and warm under the careful watch of glowing coals. True was also a secret weapon. Fine hot ash poured over the lid acted like insulation, holding in the heat for much longer than open flames alone. Not only did this trick preserve temperature, but it also freed cooks from having to constantly tend to each dish. While one meal rested under its blanket of embers, the kitchen staff could focus on preparing the next course. For banquets, where dozens of platters needed to be perfectly timed, this was invaluable. It was a clever, almost invisible technique. Guests at the feast would never see the layers of ash and ember working their quiet magic, but they would notice that every dish arrived steaming hot. In a world without ovens set to keep warm, these glowing coals were the hidden ally of every skilled cook in the medieval kitchen. Though the term bain-marie comes from later culinary traditions, the concept was already alive in medieval kitchens. Cooks discovered that placing one pot inside another filled with hot water created a gentle, steady heat that prevented food from cooling or curdling. This was especially important for sauces, custards, or soups that could easily separate if exposed to direct fire. Imagine a clay or bronze pot of spiced broth placed inside a larger cauldron of simmering water. The heat radiated evenly, keeping the liquid warm without boiling it. This method allowed a feast to continue for hours while delicate dishes retained their ideal consistency. Nobles in the Great Hall expected more than hearty meats. They wanted smooth gravies and luxurious sauces that flowed perfectly over their roasts. This double pot method was also safer for preserving flavor. Strong, smoky fire could overwhelm subtle herbs and spices, but the bain-marie acted as a shield. Garlic-infused oil, honeyed wine reductions, or almond milk-based sauces, fragile concoctions by medieval standards, were kept at the right temperature without losing their essence. The sight of a pot nestled within another may have seemed simple, yet it represented a kind of early culinary science. Medieval cooks were, in their own way, chemists of taste and texture. They knew that patience, not brute fire, kept the noble table satisfied. While peasants had little need for such refinements, in the courts of Europe, this quiet trick was the difference between an average meal and one that dazzled. Cooks also learned that covering food was just as vital as heating it. In medieval kitchens, lids were not always standard, especially for wooden or clay vessels. To solve this, cooks used cloths, sometimes wool, sometimes linen, that had been dampened or layered thickly. These makeshift covers trapped rising steam, slowing down the loss of heat. For sturdier pots, wooden or metal lids were wrapped with cloth to create insulation. A lid wrapped in wool could hold warmth longer than bare wood alone. Beyond retaining temperature, this practice had a practical side. Kitchens were smoky, dusty, and filled with the ash of open fires. Covering dishes prevented debris from spoiling carefully prepared meals. Picture a large cauldron of stew, lid pressed tightly down with a heavy cloth tied across the top. The cloth caught steam and condensed it back into drops, returning moisture to the dish. This not only kept food hot, but prevented it from drying out. A real concern when meals had to wait before being served in the Great Hall. In smaller households, the same principle was used with more modest means. A peasant might place a loaf of bread on top of a pot as an improvised lid, trapping the steam beneath. Whether for a king's feast or a farmer's supper, the idea was universal. Keep the warmth in. Keep the world out. In the grand halls of medieval castles, the distance between the kitchen and the dining tables could be vast. Food, no matter how carefully prepared, risked cooling on its journey. To solve this, servants and cooks relied on auxiliary fireplaces, small hearths built closer to where the guests dined. These were not meant for cooking entire meals, but for reheating and preserving warmth just before serving. Imagine a roasted boar carried from the kitchen through chilly stone corridors. By the time it reached the hall, it might have lost its heat. Placing it near a side fire revived its juices, allowing the dish to arrive at the noble's table with steam still rising. Stews, too, could be returned to the fire for a quick stir before being ladled into serving bowls. These fires were often discreetly placed, sometimes hidden behind screens or tucked into alcoves so as not to disturb the atmosphere of the feast. Their flames flickered, not for spectacle, but for necessity, silently maintaining the illusion that every dish had just left the kitchen. For banquets that lasted hours, with musicians playing and speeches delivered, these auxiliary fires were essential guardians of warmth. The practice reflects the deep understanding medieval households had of timing.
Food was not simply about taste, it was a performance. The arrival of steaming plates before the lord and his guests reinforced the host's wealth and generosity. Without these fires, even the most carefully planned feast could lose its impact. Another secret to keeping food warm lay in the choice of serving vessels. While metal could heat quickly, it also cooled just as fast. Wood and clay, however, offered a natural form of insulation. Thick wooden trays and heavy earthenware pots were excellent at holding on to warmth long after being filled. A stew ladled into a clay pot retained its heat better than one served in a thin metal pan. Bread, when placed on a sturdy wooden platter, stayed soft and warm instead of becoming cold and stiff. For wealthier households, glazed ceramics provided both durability and a touch of elegance, serving as both functional and decorative pieces. Earthenware especially had a unique advantage. Once heated, it slowly released warmth back into the food. A thick pot of beans or porridge resting on a table would stay invitingly hot for much longer than if served in metal.
Even peasants, with their limited means, used simple clay bowls that offered the same benefit. Wooden trenchers, flat pieces of wood or hollowed bread used as plates, also contributed. They absorbed some of the heat from hot dishes and slowed the cooling process. While practical, they also emphasized the communal nature of dining, as heat and flavor were shared across the table. These choices remind us that medieval cooks and households didn't only think about flavor or presentation, they thought carefully about material science, even if they didn't call it that. By selecting vessels that extended warmth, they made meals not just filling, but comforting. Among the more ingenious tricks of medieval cooks was the use of flour and bread as natural insulators. Some delicate dishes, particularly those rich in sauce or requiring longer holding times, were protected beneath a layer of dough. A lid made of flour paste would be spread across the top of a pot, sealing in steam and heat like a primitive pressure cover. When cracked open at the table, it released both aroma and warmth in one dramatic gesture. Bread, too, served more than its role as food. Hollowed loaves acted as edible containers into which stews or ragouts could be poured. The crust, dense and thick, formed a barrier against the cold air, keeping the contents piping hot. Guests would not only enjoy the dish itself, but could break off the softened bread infused with the meal's flavors. This trencher bread practice was widespread, uniting practicality with culinary experience. Even simple households adopted similar strategies. A pot of porridge could be topped with a thick flour paste that trapped heat until the family was ready to eat. Such methods highlight the medieval gift for improvisation, transforming ordinary ingredients into tools of preservation. To the diners, the trick may have seemed like a flourish, but to the cooks, it was necessity. With no warming trays or insulated covers, bread and dough became the humble blankets of the medieval kitchen, ensuring that the promise of warmth reached every table. Despite all these clever tricks, the challenge of keeping food hot during lengthy feasts remained nearly impossible. A noble banquet could last hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. With musicians playing between courses and elaborate rituals of serving, dishes often had to wait before reaching the high tables. To solve this, meals were served in waves, or removes. Groups of dishes brought out together, one round at a time. Instead of expecting all 20 or 30 dishes to remain hot simultaneously, cooks organized them into stages. While one remove was being enjoyed, the next was kept close to the hearth, beneath lids or buried under coals. Still, delays were inevitable. Imagine a delicate fish pie, baked perfectly in the kitchen, arriving at the Great Hall only lukewarm, after its long journey through drafty corridors. Cooks dreaded this, knowing their reputation rested on serving food at the right temperature. Servants carrying heavy trays had to move quickly, often in teams, to deliver dishes before the heat was lost. This constant struggle turned the banquet into a logistical ballet. Timing was as important as seasoning. The noble guests expected not only lavish abundance, but also steaming, fragrant meals to prove the household's sophistication. A lukewarm dish was not just a culinary failure. It could be read as a sign of poor organization or disrespect. In this way, the medieval feast was more than eating. It was theater. Behind the scenes, cooks and servants raced against the chill of stone walls and the relentlessness of time, all to preserve the fleeting warmth of food.
When we look at today's kitchens, it becomes clear that many medieval tricks never truly disappeared. They simply evolved with technology. Modern buffet lines rely on warming lamps, which echo the function of glowing embers, keeping dishes hot from above. Convection ovens that circulate heat are descendants of the enclosed hearth, distributing warmth evenly around food. Earthenware casseroles and ceramic slow cookers preserve heat much like the heavy clay pots of medieval Europe. Even the thermos, a marvel of insulation, carries the same principle as thick wooden bowls that held porridge warm through a long evening. The bain-marie, once improvised with nested pots, is now standard equipment in professional kitchens, still protecting delicate sauces from curdling. These parallels remind us that culinary innovation is not just about invention, but continuity. Each generation refines the wisdom of the last. What seemed like rustic improvisation in the Middle Ages now appears as the foundation for many of our most reliable tools. The next time a host flips on a heat lamp at a dinner party or serves soup in a heavy ceramic bowl, they unknowingly mirror the medieval cook who shielded a pot with hot ash or tucked a dish inside a loaf of bread. The desire is timeless, to preserve not only nourishment but also comfort. At its heart, the story of keeping food warm is the story of people's determination to care for one another. A hot meal has always carried meaning beyond calories. It represents hospitality, respect, and love. Medieval cooks, with their fires, coals, and improvised lids, understood this deeply. Whether in a castle's bustling kitchen or a peasant's humble cottage, the effort to serve food hot was a gesture of dignity. To share warmth at the table was to affirm community. Guests felt valued, families felt secure, and the act of eating became more than survival. It became connection. Today, though our tools have changed, the sentiment remains the same. We still gather around steaming bowls of soup, roast meats pulled straight from the oven, or bread served warm from the hearth. Each bite reminds us that we are linked, across centuries, to the same longing for comfort and belonging. In this way, the tricks of medieval cooks were never just about technique. They were about humanity's endless desire to transform necessity into care, and food into memory.